Hey everybody, let's talk about player-generated content. I've got a lot of opinions on this, but they're not quite concrete enough to be in the concrete play section of my site yet. Let's go ahead and talk about what I like in player-generated content. And this is not a value judgment, it's just what I like. The only kinds of player-generated content games I like are ones that let me turn challenges, the in-game challenges, into narratives. Basically, whatever challenges the game faces the player with, I need to be able to do stuff that will break those challenges down into bite-sized pieces of a narrative that work well in a chain, and they get more intense as they go on, and they have good emotional fulfillment at the end. And that sounds like it's really hard, right? It sounds like, what are you talking about? This is like some highfalutin theoretical stuff. Let's give you a real easy example. Dwarf Fortress. You're playing Dwarf Fortress, you're building your labyrinth below the earth, and at some point the goblins attack. Well, you've got to build some kind of defensive gateway to prevent the goblins from getting in and killing all your folks, right? The challenge here is the oncoming goblin wave. And so when the goblin wave attacks, they like scratch at your door for a while, and some of them get shot down or fall in traps and stuff. And some of them get through, and then they engage a second tier, which is like your warriors that have trained for this all their lives, and they're ready to take on the goblins. And you get to see, Smorghammer beating up goblins and taking more and more injuries as more and more goblins get through. But if the goblins get through Smorghammer, oh my gosh, they're into the inside of your fort, and they're like killing kids and farm workers and stuff. There's nobody back here that can really fight very well. And that's much more narratively intense. So the idea here is that the challenge of the goblins attacking, it gets broken down into beats based on how we've set up our defenses. And there's a million ways to build your defenses in Dwarf Fortress. So there's a lot of different ways that this can unfold. Like, do you drop the first wave of goblins into a giant pit? Do you use a steam cannon? Do you have doors that continually flicker open and closed? I don't even know if that still works anymore. Do you have murder holes? These are all things that can make the challenge unfold in a different way. And it doesn't always go linearly. Like sometimes goblins will stop at the door, a couple will get through, and then a couple more will get through, and then they'll stop at the door again. But it's always layered in such a way that each beat tier is more intense than the previous beat tier. It's also much more complicated than I made it sound in one important way. You see, this scene that I've described, that's the last part of the narrative. And this is the key. You're not just building the door for the challenge and then watching it happen. What you're doing is you built yourself an underground labyrinth, and you're thinking at all times, I've got goblins coming in. I got to prepare for the goblins. What am I gonna do to prepare for the goblins? I'm gonna go ahead and make myself a temporary entranceway, which has enough room reserved for whatever I'm planning to do with my big door. And then I've got to make sure that I set aside enough traps. I've got to make sure that I set aside some workers that can actually build it. Oh, am I getting big enough the goblins are actually going to attack now? What am I going to do next? Who do I pull off of their jobs to build this? You're planning with the goblins in mind, with the challenge in mind. So even before anything has happened, your narrative is being affected by this challenge, and you're thinking ahead, and you're starting to come up with ideas. How much effort are you going to be putting into stopping them? How many pieces can you set aside ahead of time so that it'll speed up your progress when you actually come to build it? And it's a narrative that starts to play out. It's like in the winter of 293, when the farmers were done with their harvest, they turned their hands towards construction, and we began constructing our defenses. It's a narrative beat, and it's not a very strong one, but it runs throughout your entire narrative. Everything is unified. Your fortress, the story of your fortress, includes the story of you preparing for the inevitable goblin attacks. And then, of course, you actually build it. And then when you do that, you've got a whole bunch of things, like how long does it take? How much economic damage do you suffer from taking all of those resources and workers away for however long it takes? What if you discover a diamond vein running right through where you plan to have a natural stone wall? Do you leave it there, or do you rip out the diamonds and then put up a crappy, slow-to-build stone wall of your own? Did you put aside the right amount of space, or did you misplan it? What if elves show up in the middle and see you doing stuff with wood? What if goblins show up? Goblins when you're only halfway done. Oh my gosh. What if your workers throw a tantrum because it rained? What if your workers accidentally seals himself into a wall? This is, again, part of the narrative of the overall fortress, because all of those things are bound to the way that your fortress operates. So while you're building it, you are hearing part of your story unroll. Then there's also the daily life. So outside of the actual challenge it's intended for, how does it affect the operation of your base once it's done being built? Is there a guard now that has to be on duty 24/7? Is that guard really, really friendly with all of the people because he sees all of them, because they all walk by and he always says hi? Is that guard, is that facility something that can be walked through fast enough, or do all the dwarves start taking the back exit just because they can't get through the main entrance fast enough? Or maybe it's faster. Maybe with the new flooring you put in, it's actually even better than it was before. When elves visit, how do they get through? How does it affect them? How does it affect your trading? Is it beautiful so that everybody flocks there and just hangs out and gets a mood bonus? These are all concerns that have nothing to do with how it deals with the core challenge it's intended for, but it has everything to do with how the narrative of your base unfolds. It's like, yeah, Grobnock is constantly on duty at that gate, saying hello to everybody and making sure the doors open and close properly. And that's his job. And so-and-so gets to be good friends with him, and then they get married. That's just part of the unfolding narrative. And then, of course, there's the actual challenge it was intended for, where the goblins attack. And you can see that each of these is its own phase, and they have their own pacing, and they unfold into a number of narrative beats. It's not just that the challenge itself unfolds into specific narrative beats, it's all of these phases unfold into narrative beats, largely based on your own planning, what you actually want to build. A dwarf fortress is a fairly complicated facility. It's like there's a lot of stuff going on. So let's go ahead and do something that's a little bit more basic, like, say, Kerbal, which is known for being easy and simple. In Kerbal, you build yourself a rocket, and you can build yourself a rocket that's going anywhere and doing any mission you want. So the challenges in Kerbal are almost entirely self-chosen challenges. Some of them come in packs. You're probably going to have to choose the one where you get off of the planet's surface. But by and large, you can choose your own missions. And then here's the thing. How does Kerbal translate those into narratives? How does Kerbal translate the challenges you've chosen into narrative? Well, you literally stage the narrative. You literally break it into beats and then press space between each beat. You launch off the surface of the planet. You enter circular orbit. You transfer orbits to the moon. You drop to the moon's surface. You take off from the moon's surface. You return to Kerbin. You re-enter the atmosphere, and you land. That's a mission you chose to do, and you broke it up into these phases. And you can do really complicated things with the phases, but this is the basic structure. You are, as part of the concept of building a rocket, you are building the story. You're building the narrative as you're building the rocket. And that's a wonderful thing that very rarely happens. Very few games actually do it like this. And of course, each of these phases affects the previous phases in that you have to both carry it and make sure that it's going to be usable when you get to where you need it. So you've got a parachute and a heat shield and, something for people to sit in. You have to carry all of that with you when you're returning from the moon, which means you're going to need more fuel and more thrusters and a way to transfer across. And then that means more weight for this stage, which means more weight for this stage, which means more weight for this stage, which means more weight for this stage, and more weight for this stage. And so every phase of your mission impacts all of the previous phases of your mission and may impact all the later phases depending on how you build your setup. That's wonderful. I think that that is great. Kerbal has a lot of power in this particular format, and it's something that we can learn from pretty easily, much easier than Dwarf Fortress, because it's so Spartan. There's nothing else in Kerbal. You don't have to worry about whether your crew members are happy or sad unless you do some extreme modding. You don't have to worry about how many you have. You can always just turn that crap off. All you have to worry about is literally finding a mission and breaking it apart into manageable narrative chunks. Here's another one. You're playing The Sims. So you're building yourself a house, and you got some folks living in your house, and they've got some stats, and the point of The Sims is to make your stats go up. The challenges are things like you're running out of money, or certain stats are constantly going down, and dealing with those challenges means that you create the house in a specific way, you buy specific utilities, you create a specific lifestyle. Someone goes out to work, they come home annoyed and tired, and you have to baby them a little bit. That's the pattern of The Sims, but let's give one very specific example. You want to have a family, so you're going to have a baby, and that baby is going to turn into a toddler, and then the toddler is going to turn into a kid, and then the kid is going to turn into a teenager, and so on and so on and so on. This challenge is pretty clearly already broken into major narrative beats, but even within each narrative part of the challenge, it's basically each of these is their own challenge as well as being linked. And these have the same setup that we talked about with Dwarf Fortress. So you know that you're going to want to have a family, so you plan ahead. You got to make sure you've got enough room for the kid. You got to make sure you've got someone to take care of them, so you build a character that's okay with being tired and grumpy, and loves family. You set aside enough money so that you can take a couple extra days off of work or whatever. That sort of stuff, right? You buy all of the murals and toys and whatever you'll need to take care of those kids. And then, of course, you have the kid, and you get to choose what they look like and what their skills are and what their personalities are, and all of that jazz, and how they dress. And then you get to actually deal with it as you try to live your normal life. You go to work. Oh, can you go to work? Because your baby needs some effort here, and the other person in your household is tired and sleeping. And then, of course, the challenge itself: can you raise the child's stats high enough? Can you keep them happy? Can you make them get some friends? Is their school performance going up or going down? And just as I've been talking about, this challenge is a messy challenge. It can be approached in a million different ways. It's very open-ended. It's very rare that it's a pass-fail situation. Usually it's more of how exactly you're going to pass it. How far can you push your family in order, how high can you raise their stats? How happy can you keep them? So when we think about this, we can approach it in 100 different ways. And sometimes we might approach it like, I'm going to create the perfect household for raising a kid. And other times it's like, whatever, we'll just have a kid and it'll be annoying for a while and then it'll go back to being fine. So you can approach this in a million different ways, and you can approach it at a million different volumes with a million different setups. And that's what makes it interesting, because it all ties back to the narrative of your household. If you decide you're going to make the perfect household for a kid, that tells a very different story than if you decide that you're just going to have a kid now. And, you have an actual life aside from that, and it's going to be totally interrupted. Those are very different narratives, because how you approach the situation is very different, and the situation affects everything else in the entire setup. I call this yarn balls. Yarn balls are just, like the biggest ball of twine in Minnesota. And the idea is that they are big and they are soft and they have lots of threads coming out of them going other places. And basically the player can approach the yarn ball and struggle with it. And it's soft enough that they can't really lose very, very easily. If they do lose, it's not terribly damaging to them. And even if they manage to sort out the yarn ball a little bit and figure out how to get through it, there's still a lot of other stuff going on that they're going to have to deal with, and a lot of other ramifications, like, oh, did you figure out how to launch a rocket in Kerbal? Well, congrats. Now you have to figure out how to launch a rocket and then have a lander on top. How are you going to put a lander on the moon? Something with wheels. How are you going to put a rover on the moon? That's quite a bit harder than it sounds. And it makes you go back to the starting board because you're like, okay, well, now I can't launch the rocket like that because I need a completely different setup. And that's the joy of this. It's complicated and soft in and of itself, and it can be approached in 100,000 different ways, but it's also tied up with all of these other things going on. Once you understand what you're trying to accomplish, you can usually retrofit most of your challenges to become narratives according to player-generated content. You just need to think about it a little bit, and like, how do I want this to work? How do I want this to be a narrative? What will break it into narrative beats? So here's an example of a sort of player construction game I actually don't like, and that would be the shooty pew pew ship construction games, because choosing how many missiles and how many turrets and how many shields and how big your engines are, that's not really very interesting to me. It's a very statistical, grindy sort of thing, and the actual play of fighting somebody is really, really tired at this point. It always breaks down in the same 8 or 9 ways, and I have seen it way too many times to care. So for me, if you are making the player customization part, the player construction part, if that's about making something that fights, I'm probably not going to be interested in it, because the narrative of fighting is something I have seen too much. It just doesn't break down in any way that ever feels interesting to me anymore, because I have seen all of the ways it can break down. And that's not necessarily, I'm not saying that's a bad kind of game. It's just that I have become inured to the stories that it's trying to tell. So on the other hand, let's take a look at something like Star Citizen, which has this same problem, right? It's mostly a shooty game. You can do shipping, but it's shipping in the context of you're going to get shot at a lot. But let's take a look at, more importantly to me, how it feels to be in that universe. When you're in a ship, you actually have very detailed interiors on all of these ships, and they have like beds and kitchens and stuff and bathrooms and seats. And whenever I see that, I'm always blown away by how amazing that interior looks, and how I would just love to spend more time in these ships. And they have talked about, I'm not going to say that they're going to develop this or not, I don't know a thing about it, but they've talked about the fact that there will be survival elements in this game, in which case the interior of your ship would matter, because you would have to do things to keep yourself healthy or whatever. So let's talk about a theoretical world where I and you were designing the challenge of the survival components of the game. How could we make that challenge turn into a narrative? How could we break that basic survival challenge into chunks and have it dole out narrative elements one by one, with each one being deeper than the previous? That sounds really quite complicated, but if we think about it, what sort of narrative do we want out of this? We want the narrative of us living in deep space. We want the narrative of us feeling the weight of the distance. The stars are heavy on us because we are, sitting on our bed, and there's nothing out there, and we're just kind of gazing out at the stars. We want to feel that without having to actually live it, right? So the narrative for us would be one, perhaps, here's a choice, one where you are trying to stay, I don't want to say sane. I don't want to say sane. You're trying to stay happy. Like in The Sims, you've got a number of bars that go down. I don't want the bars to punish you if you let them floor. I wouldn't want them to. I wouldn't want the game to be like, oh, you're not happy enough, and therefore you're losing. But what I wouldn't mind is if our challenges to keep our characters happy created that tiered narrative of us doing things on our journey. And here's the key. Because we want that narrative to unfold over time, What we want is we want the characters to get steadily more unhinged. The longer you stay away from an actual starbase with actual amenities, the more unhinged you're going to get. Unless you've built your interiors specifically to allow for that kind of travel. So what I might do is I might say something like every jump that you go on induces another step of decay on your stats. And it's just, we're not talking combat stats here, we're just talking about personal mood stats. And depending on what you've got in your ship, that decay can be ablated. So if you're getting hungry, then if you've got a kitchen on your ship, you don't suffer. It just recharges. We could make it so that you have to go and eat at the kitchen, but I'm not sure that's a great idea. I think that what we would do is we would allow you to eat at the kitchen to boost yourself past 100% to get an extra bonus briefly when you're planning to do something dangerous or whatever. Similarly, you might have to go to the bathroom. Well, if your ship has a bathroom, then you don't have to worry about it. We again don't want to bother the player with actually having to go and take a shit or a shower, just because those things aren't fun and they're not part of the narrative beats. But what sort of narrative are we really building if we just have, a steady decay of stats? We can tier it, right? So we can have it so that, as you go out there, it's not just things like hunger and needing to go to the bathroom. It's also things like joy and loneliness and stuff like that. And those decay at a much slower rate. But they are also things that are more difficult to recharge. In order to create the narrative beats, what we would want to do is push the player to engage not just with the interior of their ship, but with other elements in the universe. For example, let's say that you can recharge your claustrophobia. As you're stuck inside the ship getting claustrophobic, you can recharge that by landing on a planet. Or if your joy is getting low, or if your loneliness is getting high, you can recharge that by greeting someone over the radio or docking with a ship or something similar to that. If your entertainment is getting low, you can refill it by communicating with another ship and transferring entertainment media between the two of you, swapping cassette tapes, basically. These are things that would enable us to build a story of you're out in the black, you are lonely and you're alone, but you can't stay that way. You have to be connected to the people around you, to the places around you. You have to be in that world. Even though you're stuck inside of a metal box, you have to be where the metal box is. You have to live in that universe with all the other people that live in that universe. And I think that that would be enough to generate fun narratives out of a survival element. And you can tweak it to weight it however you want it for your game's precise needs. But the point here is that the narrative beats that get created are all about who you have to visit, how much you have to visit people, where you have to go. They're all about, do you retrofit your interiors to keep you isolated and alone for as long as possible? Or do you accept that you're going to want to occasionally contact somebody, occasionally stop in somewhere and say hi? These are the sorts of things that I think about when I am thinking about how to tier a survival system. I would like to talk a lot more about that. That deserves its own video because there is, in fact, an entire play style hiding underneath the current generation of space games, which does this, and I've got some ideas about that. But I think that's where we're going to leave it for now because it has been half an hour, and I'm sure you're tired of listening to my voice. Let me know down below if any of this made sense or if you have other opinions or observations, because this is something that I'm not 100% solid on. It's not concrete yet, but hopefully it will be someday.